Thank you everyone for joining. Today's topic is building single-page applications with Grails and the Vue JavaScript library. Your presenter today is Zach Klein. Zach is a senior software engineer here on the Grails team at OCI. And with that, I turn it over to you, Zach.
Thank you, Nikki. Welcome, everyone. This is a single-page apps with Grails and Vue.js, and I am Zachary Klein, senior software engineer here at OCI. Give me a second here. Got to get my controls arranged so I can see my screen. So I've been working at OCI since about 2015, and I've been doing web development for a bit longer than that, with a mixture of both back-end and front-end development. And so these days I do a lot of work with Grails and with Micronauts, as well as doing front-end development and training and other things alongside of that. And I'm based out here in St. Louis, Missouri, where the OCI office also resides. A couple of things I just want to point out. Just I like to put these websites out just in case folks are not aware of them. The Grails application forge, start.grails.org. This is the place to go to start creating a new Grails application. And that would include a Grails application with Vue.js, because there is a Vue.js profile that's available from the application forge. And also, just in case you haven't heard yet, Grails 4 RC1 is out and is also available from the application forge. So definitely recommend, if you're wanting to play with Grails or get started with a new project, that is the place to go.
And then Zach, also, we have a question about that. Is this webinar going to be focused on Grails 3 or Grails 4?
Excellent question. So actually, both. Very little changes as far as the single-page application development flow with Grails 4. So the sample code I'm going to be showing will be Grails 4. The code in the slide is taken from a Grails 3 project. However, I don't think you're going to see any differences because the improvements and the features in Grails 4 reside nicely alongside the existing single-page application support in Grails 3. So whatever you learn here will apply to both. Good question. And then also the Grails guides website, check that out. We have several guides on Vue.js actually specifically available there, but lots of other topics, lots of neat tricks and very practical solutions are available there. So that's aside from the user guide and documentation, this is definitely the place to go when you're looking for some official sample code and tutorial sort of documentation for Grails. And there's equivalent site, of course, for Micronaut as well, but that's not the topic today. So our agenda, we're going to introduce Vue.js, and this is a lot to pack into a 1-hour webinar. So I'm going to have to move fairly fast, but I'm going to try to introduce the Vue.js library, and then I'm going to go into some features with features in Grails specific to building applications with Vue.js, especially single-page applications. And then we're going to look a little bit into JWT RESTful security with Spring Security. And in our demo, we're going to show kind of all that stuff pulled together. And if we have time, we're going to fit in a little demo on packaging up a Grails and Vue.js application into a single deployable artifact jar file. So that'll be the bonus if we can get through the rest of the material in time. So let's jump right in. So what is Vue? Hopefully most folks joining here have some idea of what Vue.js is, and that's why you're interested. But I'll give a quick bit of background here. Vue.js is a Vue library, and I imagine that's probably where the name came from. And it's a lot of things going for Vue. One of my favorites is that, considering how new the library is, it was only released, I believe, in 2014 was the initial release, and then the current major version, I believe, is a couple years after that. It has a very mature ecosystem. There's a lot. Vue is a Vue library, and so it doesn't have a lot of the features like state management and other things that a lot of JavaScript and front-end developers want. But for the most part, there are official libraries and solutions built up around Vue. Generally speaking, if you need something, if you need a router, if you need state management, there is a widely accepted option or library out there ready for you to use. And so the ecosystem is very full-featured. I've not found anything that I wanted to do where I needed a library and couldn't find one for Vue.js. So that's pretty impressive considering how new the library is. It's got a ton of features here. This is just, I picked out the dev tools because I find them particularly helpful. Vue has a very active community, very actively developed. And then we will talk a little bit about how Vue stacks up with Angular and React. I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But I will give at least my high-level impressions of kind of where Vue stands in comparison to Angular and to React, since those are its two biggest competitors in the front-end space these days. So to get started with Vue, the easiest way and the best way is to use the Vue CLI. Version 3 was released several months ago now, and it makes it really trivial to get started. So you will need to have npm, and that will mean node installed in order to run this command. But once you do, you install Vue/CLI, and that will give you access to the Vue CLI, and you can just run a command like Vue create project, and that will generate a fully bootstrapped Vue.js project with all the configuration you need. It's a very full-featured CLI, and that makes it really easy to get started building an actual Vue application. If we have time, I might show a quick demo of what that looks like in a moment here. That said, to really get started with Vue, you don't even need Node or npm. Vue is a very minimalistic library, and you can actually get started simply on a page of HTML, like what you're seeing here. So this is a snippet from an HTML page, no other JavaScript anywhere on the file system for this project. You just need to have some way of bringing in the Vue library itself. So you can do that with a script tag, or you can obviously grab the JavaScript source itself and add it to your project. And then you just initialize a Vue instance. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you're up and running. You can start using all the key features of the Vue library from that point. You don't need Webpack. You don't need any build tooling. Very easy to get started in this fashion. I would not recommend it if you're looking at actually building a real app and starting to do anything with any complexity. Although I will say that if you're not building a single page application and you just want to introduce Vue into an application that, let's say, is using jQuery, or maybe it's a Grails application and you're using GSP, what the code you see here is perfectly viable, and you really could start to build little portions of your app as Vue components using an approach like this. You just would not want to build a single page application with this approach, and that's what we're talking about today. So yes, the highlighted section there, that is the Vue instance. That's where the magic starts to happen, and we'll talk more about the Vue instance right now. So a Vue instance is really the ground zero for any Vue.js application or Vue.js sub-component if you're using it in a non-single page context. The Vue instance is instantiated, obviously, with new Vue, and then you pass it an object, which is referred to, generally speaking, I see it referred to as the instance definition. That's what I call it. So that object you see there with all these keys, EL, which is for element, data, methods, template, all those keys exist within this instance definition object. And that object, it follows the same sort of conventions, whether you're creating an instance with new Vue on the left there, or on the right-hand side, we're creating a component. And I'll explain the difference there just a minute. But you'll notice that when you define a Vue component, you basically export that instance definition object. And that's really what you're doing. You're basically saying, okay, here is the object that I want to be used, that I want to have used to create my Vue component. And so behind the scenes, Vue is going to basically call a new Vue on that object. So this object is kind of the important thing. And one of the nice things about Vue is that you can really kind of grow into the library by simply learning the new keys and new features that are supported by this object. So you might start off with just something really simple like element and data, for example, and I'll explain what those are. And then as you get more comfortable with it, now you add some methods, and then you might add a template and so forth. And so the API is really easy to learn in that way, because you just start off with a minimal object and add on features as you need them. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those keys that get passed into the Vue instance. EL, which is for element, that's a pretty important one. You need this in order to create a Vue application and render it somewhere on an HTML page. So the purpose of the element key is to specify a DOM element. So typically it's going to be something like a div where you want your app to render. Normally, you will only do this once if you're writing a Vue application, if you're writing a single page app, for example, because you only want to start rendering to the HTML page in one place. You will have Vue components that will be rendered inside of that div, that will be rendered inside of this element, but you don't render to multiple elements. So typically, you will only do this for your top level Vue instance. And when we look at the sample code, you'll see what I mean there. The next really important one is data. Data really expresses the state. So if you're familiar with React, this is the equivalent to the state object in a React component. So that the data object is describes the data within this Vue instance. And notice I have here app/component. Again, we'll talk about the distinction in a minute, but that essentially means an instance versus a component. They both have a data function, or a data object rather. And the data object's properties are subjected to reactive rendering. And so that means that when you update something in the data object, anywhere else where it's being used is going to also be updated. And so you have basically two-way binding as well as one-way binding. You can really do both ways. And if you're not familiar with one-way and two-way binding, it's not really important to this particular webinar, but if you're familiar with React or Angular, you'll probably know what I'm talking about there. The important part is that Vue handles both. You could add new properties to your data object. However, when you add a new property, at least in the current versions of Vue, that new property will not be subjected to that reactive updating. And so typically what you want to do is you want to have all of the keys, all of the properties in your state defined up front, even if they're blank or null. And then from then on, you can update them and they'll respond accordingly. And the last point to mention is that when you're creating a Vue component, you have to actually return your object from a data function. It's not simply an object. And this next slide will show you what I mean there. So on the left-hand side, we're creating a new Vue instance. Again, this is what you're more likely to do when you're creating your Vue app from scratch, or when you're creating the top-level component in your application. And you see there the data key has an object, which is the state for this Vue instance. We have my value, we have my object, which is an object which has a property itself. Now on the right-hand side, we're defining a Vue component. And the important thing there is that we still have the same data object, but it's being returned from a function called data. And there's an important reason for that we probably won't have time to go into. But when you see the examples, it's not hard to remember. When you're writing components, you use a function. And realistically, most of the time, you are writing components. You're not putting data into your top-level Vue instance like you see on the left. So it's not as confusing as it might seem here. You almost always will be doing what you see on the right-hand side of the slide. A bunch of the Vue instance supports lots of other things, and I don't have time to go into detail on any of them. I'm just going to highlight 3 of them that I think we'll probably make use of in this webinar. Methods is going to be, the key methods will have a value that is an object, which is simply a bunch of functions. So you write, if you have any sort of behavior you want to add to your component, for example, you can define a function within this methods block. And that function can access and manipulate the data, the state for the instance. And that method can also be called from a template. It can be called as an event handler. Computed refers to computed properties. These are also functions, but they work a little differently. They are functions that are actually accessed as though they were properties, as though they were part of your state. So if you had a function, let's say current date as a computed property, you would refer to it as though it was just a property in your state called current date. However, that computed property is actually a function that might calculate the date, for example. That's probably not a realistic example, because what you really want to do with computed is you can perform, you can return dynamic values based on things in your states. Let's say you have some numbers in your instance data. You can have a computer property that computes some algorithm based on those values. Now, the cool thing is that Vue will actually cache that result, so that unless the data variables change, the function will not be called again. The cached value will be returned instantly. So that's the advantage of computed over a simple method, is that so long as you're relying on data within your component, it can actually cache those results and save you a lot of computation time, depending on what kind of work you're doing. And then lifecycle methods. If you're familiar with React or Angular, you probably know what these are about. These are special functions that are called by Vue at certain points along the Vue's the instance lifecycle. So, for example, when a component is created, there is a created function that can be called. So you implement that created function. It's sort of the equivalent of the component did mount in React for those that are familiar with React. But that function is going to be called, and we'll see examples of that quite a bit. It's a very popular one, and there's a lot of lifecycle methods, and the Vue documentation describes all of them. Vue templates are essentially HTML. You can actually use JSX. So if you're familiar with React, that is an option. You can use JSX in Vue, and that works just fine. But it's not typical. Most folks will use the HTML-based template, and you'll notice here that if you're familiar with Angular, it's quite similar. We have things like a v-model. So we have directives that can be used for data binding. There's logical directives. Unfortunately, I tried to turn on my my laser pointer and it's not working. So I can't highlight these things. Hopefully people are following along. But if you look down there kind of towards just below the midsection of this code snippet, you can see we have a v-if directive. So you can do conditional logic. We have a v-for down there for iteration. If you look towards the very bottom, there's an @click attribute on that button towards the bottom of the code snippet. And that's calling a method that's going to be defined probably in our methods section of our instance. And that's setting up an event handler for the click event. So I'm not going to detail the syntax right now. We just don't have time for that. But hopefully you can see it's pretty intuitive if you're familiar at all with basic event handling in JavaScript and HTML. And if you're familiar with Angular, this will look very similar to you, other than the V prefix for the directives. And we'll see more examples of just specific questions when we look at code. I can hopefully clear those up. But that's the templating syntax. And then lastly, okay, components. So a Vue instance can be a component, or it can just be a standalone instance of the Vue object, right? So when it's a component, what does that mean? A component means that the Vue instance has a template and that it's set up in such a way that it can be rendered as a child of another component. So it can be within another component's template, right? So once a Vue instance is simply a Vue component is a Vue instance that is made into a component. It has its own template. It can be rendered in place. It can be rendered onto another template. And so typically the way you do that, you can create components just with straight JavaScript. However, what's going to be much more typical is to create these .vue files. And a .vue file combines the template section you see there at the top. That's the template that's the template syntax we were just looking at. And then has a script section which exports that default object, which is the instance definition we were talking about. So that's basically saying, to the build tool, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There's build tooling involved here, but that'll basically tell the build tool that this block of JavaScript, this object, is going to be used to instantiate a Vue component. And then finally, there's a style section, and this allows you to have style sheets that are specific to your component. So this format with a template, a script section, and a style section makes up the .vue file. Now, .vue file does require build tooling. So you'll recall with our very simple example at the beginning, you don't need any build tooling. You can just go straight ahead with straight HTML and JavaScript. When you want to start building with components, you're going to probably want to use some of the build tooling. For example, if you use the Vue CLI, that's all set up for you. But you're going to want to use that because you have to pre-process these .vue files. Obviously, a browser isn't going to know how to read them. But they do make the development experience with Vue much more pleasant. And so I'm not even showing the other way of creating components because I don't recommend it. I think this is definitely the most accessible way to create components. And again, we're going to see examples of this shortly here. In fact, I think at this point, I'm going to jump into a very quick demo. So let me jump out of the slide deck here. I'm going to check this QA real fast and see what we have. Okay, so I see some folks saying that this has become a Vue.js introduction. Yes, I apologize. We're about done with that part. But if you look at the agenda, that is the first section, is a Vue.js introduction. So believe me, I could go into much more detail. However, I just want to do enough to make sure that we are all on the same page. Looks like my IDE maybe shut down on me. So give me a second here. Well, actually, I'm just going to jump to the terminal. There we go. Okay, here we go. All right. So I've already got the Vue CLI installed here. So I'm just going to create a project real fast. So bear with me. CD talks. All right. So I'm going to say Vue. I have the Vue CLI already installed. So I say Vue create and then hello world. And this is going to generate a project. I'm not going to walk through the options. The CLI lets you pick a lot of different options for how you want your project to behave. And once that generates, I'm going to go ahead and open it in WebStorm. Should be open here in just a minute. More questions here. All right, our project is built. I'm going to go ahead and open it up now in WebStorm. We'll take a really quick look around just so you can see. I want to highlight a couple of things I was talking about. Oops, I think I picked the wrong file. I want to highlight a couple things I was talking about just so everyone's clear on the difference between a component and an instance, especially since I know that at least for me, that was a bit confusing when I was first getting started. So let me just open this up real fast. There we go. All right, so hopefully that's big enough for everyone to see. I'm going to jump down here into the source directory. There's a component directory. So if we take a look here at main.js, this is sort of the bootstrap file that sets up the single page Vue application. And notice that this is where the new Vue instance is being installed, is being instantiated. I'm not going to talk about the details here. The point is that this is where you're seeing new Vue. And now the other, in the Vue components, like for example, the app component here, this is a component. We're simply exporting our definition object. We have our template. Notice in this template here, we are using another component. And this is how you know that you're dealing with components here. Components can be embedded within other components templates. And so I can click here into hello world, and I can see the hello world components right here. This is running out a bunch of markup. I'm not going to spend much more time on this. I just wanted to point out the difference there between setting up. So again, you're going to typically do this new Vue when you're creating a new application and you just want to kick things off, and then you'll use components from then on. Okay, let's see here. Let's jump back to the code. So real briefly, I'm going to talk a bit about Vue versus Angular and React. I'll spend no more than a minute on this. The short story is that Vue takes a lot of good ideas from Angular, but makes it much simpler. The learning curve for Vue is much lower than with Angular, in my opinion. I find that Vue code is much more readable and more straightforward because there's not a lot of boilerplate and overhead by comparison. I'm not saying this is a bad thing about Angular. There's a reason why Angular works the way it does. However, especially for folks that are new to front-end development, I often find that Vue is one of the easiest frameworks to introduce them to. So, but you know, with that said, Vue is not technically a framework. It is a Vue library, and as a result, there are things that you're likely going to need to add on in addition to the core library, which is very similar to React. And so Vue is really very much a sibling as far as where it sits in the front-end space with React. Very similar conceptually. The way the component model works, the reactivity, the virtual DOM, which we didn't talk about, lifecycle methods. You can use JSX with Vue. In my experience, Vue tends to simplify some things over React. However, it does so by being a little more pragmatic, and there's times where the React way might be a little more programmatically simple versus Vue, which might have a little more magic going on behind the scenes. I find it strikes a nice balance. I like all three of these frameworks. I actually prefer React myself if I'm just coding on my own, but I think Vue has a lot going for it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do we use this stuff with Grails. If you're familiar with Grails 3, you probably know that we have these this idea of profiles, which basically are bootstrapped pre-configurations for Grails projects. So we have profiles for creating RESTful applications. We have a profile for just a standard Grails web application. And we also have several profiles for single-page application projects. For example, we have one for Angular, we have one for React, and we do have one for Vue. and Vue profile is the newest, but they all basically follow the same sort of structure. So before we get into that, let's talk about why we might want to use Vue and other JavaScript frameworks with Grails. Now, I'm really talking about the angle of why should you consider using Grails as a backend for these things. I mean, Grails still has a lot going for it. The convention over configuration, the developer productivity, the fact that you really do have great compatibility with Spring Boot. The Gradle build tool gives you a lot of flexibility, especially when you actually want to start pulling in front-end related things. There's lots of cool Gradle tricks to make that more seamless. Grails is really ideal for creating RESTful controllers. JSON views is one of my favorite features of Grails, and I make use of that a lot. And then GORM, of course, for persistence. And especially, I really like the GORM GraphQL support. I find that really compelling. And GraphQL is really fun to code against with Vue, as well as other front-end libraries. So Grails has a lot going for it. Now, the reason why you might want to consider using Vue on top of your Grails application, a lot of that's going to do simply to, let's see, why use Grails at all instead of Micronaut as a back? That's kind of off topic here. You can use Micronaut if you want. If you're building microservices, I would definitely recommend Micronaut. But that's a much broader topic. So this webinar is about Grails and Vue. So we're going to keep on that track for now. We can talk more about that at the end, perhaps. So the reasons why you might want to use Vue as opposed to GSPs, for example, is that you're going to get a much more modern front-end development experience. And these days, that's where the front-end development interest is going to be. And there's a lot of advantages to the newer frameworks. There is some complexity, but they do bring a lot of really rich behavior to the table. And I've personally found them to be quite fun to develop with, to be honest. And so there's a lot of reasons why you might want to consider moving to a single-page application with Vue or with React, for example, on your existing Grails app. And the cool thing is that you don't have to do this all at once. You can do this piecemeal. Vue especially is very amenable to creating subcomponents of your UI as Vue components, for example, and just rendering them in a specific div. You don't have to go single page application all at once, although that's going to be basically the approach we'll see going forward here. So there's several approaches to using JavaScript frameworks with Grails, and I have a whole talk on this subject, and so we're just going to really briefly jump over this. There is the asset pipeline, which is a really cool front-end tool. It does support Vue, although that's kind of new. But the approach we're going to talk about, and this is the approach taken by the Vue profile, so I'm not going to really go over this slide. The approach that we take in the Vue profile is what I call the multi-project build. The idea here is that we are going to have a separate standalone client application, which is in this case going to be our Vue.js application. It's going to have a REST API Grails application. So that means no GSPs, no asset pipeline, just JSON views and RESTful controllers. And the server project is going to expose an API to the client project, and the client project will consume it. And that's going to be your basic architecture for this application. So if you're using the Vue profile, this is what you get by default. No extra work has to be done. Everything's going to be configured for you. It is a Gradle multi-project build, which gives us some cool abilities that we might get to look at a little bit later, because it allows us to use Gradle to kind of combine the build processing between the two projects, and even to the level of the NPM and node-based build tasks. So Gradle's awesome and makes this sort of approach really feasible. So that's sort of the high level what it looks like. So to use the Vue profile, you can obviously go to start.grails.org and select the Vue profile there. At the bottom, you can see that curl command. So you can actually, from the command line, you can generate your project that way. And then you can also, if you have Grails installed and you're using the create app command, just pass the profile flag and pick Vue. So it's a core Grails profile. It's actively maintained. I maintain it, and I intend to keep it up to date. And that's where we're going to be. That's the sample project we're looking at from now on is going to be built with this Vue profile. So just a quick kind of tour of how the profile works. So the Grails server application is using the REST API profile. So that's it's a profile within a profile. So hopefully that's not too confusing. But the Vue profile creates a Grails application that is using the REST API profile, if that makes sense, because they are two separate applications. And that's ideal because if you're building a single page application, then your backend doesn't really need to render HTML or anything like that. It can just expose RESTful endpoints, and then we'll consume those via Ajax from our single page application. And then, of course, we have to have CORS, cross-origin resource, and I forgot what the S stood for. We have to have CORS support enabled, which is honestly trivial in Grails these days, but it is set up for you by default. Now, on the client side, the front-end project, this is built using the Vue CLI. And in the current RC of Grails 4, this is built with the latest version of the CLI, so I have upgraded that. You're going to make use of a REST client in order to communicate back to the server to grab data from it, for example, and that's already set up for you. And then there also is a custom UI skin over the default Vue CLI, just to make it more uniform with Grails. So to fire it up, you can use npm. So the front end Vue project has a package.json file, and you can run npm start, npm install, all those sorts of commands will work. However, we also have the Gradle node plugin engaged here. So in addition to being a straight Vue CLI project, there's also a build.gradle file within this front end Vue project. And that plugin allows us to actually delegate the npm and the front end build steps to Gradle. And what does that mean? Well, it means that instead of having to have node and npm installed and run npm install and npm start, for example, you can actually run those all with Gradle commands. So you can run as Gradle tasks, you can run Gradle client : start. So client is the subproject, start is the task. There are Gradle tasks that basically are aliases for all of the default npm scripts. This actually is more impressive maybe than you might seem, because what it means is that if you have, for example, a front-end team that's working on the Vue side of the project, those folks probably are comfortable with Node and with npm or Yarn or whatever their preferred tooling is. And they can actually use that tooling natively. They don't need to touch Gradle. They don't need to worry about that at all. They can fire up the application. They can run tests. They can do whatever they want in the front-end side without needing to, fire up Java at all. However, for the back-end developers, the guys working on the server project, for example, they don't need to worry about having Node installed. They can use Gradle to delegate those tasks, and the Gradle Node plugin will actually, in the background, download and cache an installation of Node and of npm and whatever other tooling is needed. And this means that front-end and back-end developers each can stick with their own set of tools. The back-end guys can the back-end folks can keep using Gradle. The front-end folks can be using npm or what have you. And so I found in my experience, this does make for a nice development experience. Even for me, I tend to be working on both sides because I do back-end development as well. But there's times where the npm tools are a little bit faster, just a little more handy than running a Gradle command. And so it's really cool to have the option to do both in the same project without any special configuration. Again, this is all what you get by default. This is how the Vue profile is set up by default. Let's move on from there. Oops, hang on. Object marshaller. The question about using object marshaller, that's basically about an alternative to JSON views. The answer is yes, but we really do recommend JSON views over marshallers these days. And then the Vue profile does not include a login page, but we will see an example of that in our sample today. And the code will be available, so you can take a look at that. But no, there's no security set up by default with the Vue profile. So, oops, I skipped over some things there. Hang on. Okay, so yeah, the advantages of the Gradle Node plugin is that you can standardize Node versions. You don't have to worry about making sure everyone's running the same version of Node because the build.gradle file will specify the version. It installs Node project locally, so you can have different versions of Node on different projects with no conflicts. And then, as I said, it delegates any npm or Yarn tasks that you need to run. So really handy plugin, a big advantage, in my opinion, of using Gradle. In fact, I often will throw a Gradle file into a standalone Vue project, even if I'm not using Grails, just because I find it really handy. I no longer have to worry about making sure I have the right version of Node installed, and that's cool. So to fire this stuff up, I'm not sure what's going on there. I got some weird animations here. You can fire up the backend project just like you would normally. You can run Grails run app or Gradle boot run, and that's going to fire up the backend server. That's the Grails server. It'll run on port 8080 as normal. And then you can access that endpoint, and you'll get back the default JSON that you would see if you were building any other Grails REST API. If you're familiar with that profile, instead of getting the index GSP page, you just get a index of JSON that has a bunch of application metadata. Separately, then, in a separate terminal session, you're going to run either Gradle start on the client project, or you can run npm start. And that Vue project is going to run on port 3000 by default. And that's going to be your Vue application. And it's going to communicate with the back end. So you'll want to start the back end up first. It'll communicate with the back end. It'll retrieve that same metadata you would normally see in the GSP homepage on a Grails project, and it will display there like normal. Let's see here. Can we use Spring Security Core plugin? Absolutely, you can. We'll get to security here shortly. I think we've gotten all the questions I see there. I think have all been answered. And then the last thing, this is, we'll try to have time, hopefully we'll have time to show this at the end here. We're about to go into our main demo, which is where we'll spend the rest of the webinar. But one of the cool things about the multi-project build with Gradle is that it allows you to do some cool things like, for example, you can, and this diagram, I apologize, is showing a React logo because I pulled it from a React talk, but it's completely irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. It can be Vue, it could be Angular. But what you can do with Gradle, with a multi-project build, you can actually run the front-end build. You can create the production version of your Vue.js project, for example, and copy it into your Grails application. And what that means is that you can generate a single jar file or war file. And the example we'll see is going to be using an executable jar file. But you can have a single jar file that will actually include your front-end JavaScript and render it as you'd expect. There's a bit of configuration involved here, and we'll take a look at that. And there's also a Grails guide available for this particular very same example on the Grails guide site. This is really handy for smaller projects, especially, or for organizations where you don't have a pipeline for deploying a standalone JavaScript application, for example. You can use an approach like this to combine the two projects and end up with a single artifact to deploy that has the front end included with the back end, which is basically the same experience you would get with a traditional Grails application with GSPs. And so this can be a nice trick if you're introducing a single page application architecture in an organization that's not really set up to deploy the front end separately. Obviously, there's advantages to deploying it separately because it lets you update the front end separately from the back end, and there's definitely flexibility there. But if that's not flexibility you need, and if that's actually more complexity than is worth for you, you can use this combined build approach. And we at OCI, we do this a lot with IoT sort of applications where we want to run on, say, a Raspberry Pi, a small computing device, and we don't want to have to run two servers. We'll just create an executable jar file that includes both our front end and our back end and drop that on the device. And it makes it really easy to stand up a full stack application. So not going to be the solution for everyone, but it's a tip that I think is worth knowing about. And hopefully we'll get to see it here shortly. Okay, so a few more slides here. We're going to just briefly do a high-level discussion of JWT security with Spring Security REST, and then we'll jump into the demo and hopefully get to see all the stuff in action. So there was a question earlier about Spring Security Core, and absolutely you can use Spring Security Core with Vue. The factor with Spring Security by default is that it's using a session-based authentication scheme. And that means that there's state kept on the server, and there's usually a cookie or something that you use to keep track of your session ID. And the server basically decides when the session is valid and when it expires and so forth. And that's sort of the standard Spring Security Core model. However, Spring Security REST enables a stateless authentication model. So this means that we're using tokens instead of sessions. And this means that there is no state on the server. Instead, when the user authenticates, the server will generate a token that will contain all the information about the user that is necessary for their authentication and authorization. So that token will include details about their role. It'll include, it'll have basically the expiration will be pre-baked into the token. And this approach is really designed for securing RESTful APIs, which is basically what you're doing. If you are building a single page application that's backed by a REST API, token-based authentication tends to be the way you want to go. You can certainly use the traditional Spring Security authentication model, and I've seen it done, but it's not as I'm not sure I want to go into the differences why you might do one or the other. So suffice it to say that stateless token-based authentication is much more typical for building a single-page application. I'm not going to go into I didn't really prepare to go into the details for why you do one or the other. It's not required. You can do it with the session cookie way, but there are advantages to doing it in the stateless manner. But that's a topic for a talk on Spring Security REST, which I don't have time to do right now. And Spring Security REST supports multiple token types as well. We're going to be looking at JWT, which is JSON Web Tokens. Those are the most, probably the most popular format. But you can also have GORM, basically domain class tokens, which is pretty powerful because it lets you actually have state in addition to a token. You can use Redis, Memcache. There's a lot of options for how you want to handle both the token and how you store it. And so to use the plugin, you simply add the dependency to your build.gradle file, and it's and there's some default configuration you need to add, and the documentation covers all of that. JWT, JSON Web Token, is just an open standard for how to represent claims, which loosely corresponds to authorities or roles. So this is basically a standard way of indicating that this particular user or consumer of the API has, or at least claims to have, these abilities, these roles, for example. And there's a format that's standard here. There's an encoding standard. We're not going to go into all of that because you don't really have to. It's basically handled for you by the Spring Security REST plugin. But that's what we're going to be using in this example. So when you're doing a token-based authentication, this is basically the flow. And this is not specific to JWT, even though we're going to be using JWT in our case. The basic idea is that the client is going to make a request for some resource. And if they are not authenticated, if they don't have the correct authorization, they're going to get a 401. And then the client should respond to that 401 by prompting the user to provide login credentials. So let's say a username or password, if that's what you're doing. And then it's going to post those credentials to a defined login endpoint. The server then is going to validate the credentials. It's going to figure out if this user is valid and what their roles are. And then the server will generate a token. Now, the diagram here says that it's going to generate and store the token. That's not necessary. And in fact, in Grails, with Spring Security REST, the token is not stored by default. You can store it, but you'll have to create a domain class or something to do that persistence. But in any case, the server will generate the token and return it to the client. The token then is going to have some sort of an access key that the client is going to include in the authorization header for all future requests. So now when the client makes the same request, it's going to have an additional header, an authorization header, that will include that token. And then, so long as that token is valid and provides access to the resource, to the API endpoint, for example, in question, the server will respond with the resource. And that will continue to work until that token expires. And there is a flow here for doing refresh and reloading tokens as well. But that's the basic flow here. So you can see that it's stateless because once the server generates the token, it doesn't really keep track of what's happening with it after that point. The token will expire on its own, and when it expires, the server will start returning 401s, and the client will have to either try to refresh the token or prompt the user to log in again. So that's the basic flow there, as opposed to a session where the server will create a session with an ID, return the ID as a cookie, for example, and then the server basically controls when the session times out and so forth. So there's advantages to both of these approaches, and again, I just don't have time to go into that topic right now. And I don't have any material on that right now, but we're going to be looking at this JWT model since that is dominantly the most popular way to do security in single page applications these days. So with that, we are ready for our demo. So I'm going to move some things around here. And we got about 15 minutes left, or just a little under that. I think that should be enough. We'll put this WebStorm project away. And so what I have here now, hopefully everyone can see my IDE. What I have here now is a Grails application built with the Vue profile. I can demonstrate that by going, well, let me see if I can find it here. There it is. So if I go to the build.gradle file, I can see that we are using the Vue profile for this project. So let's go ahead and look at the project structure here real quick. We got a Gradle, a server sub-project. This is our Grails application. There's our Grails app directory. And then separately from that, we have our client application. The client directory, this is a Vue CLI project. So you'll notice the project structure is quite different. We have a source directory, which includes our components and other artifacts for the Vue application. And then we have a public directory that includes our default index HTML page. So that's a pretty typical Vue.js format. Let's see if we got more questions here. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire this application up, and then we'll kind of talk about what it does from there. So let's go ahead and start up the Grails application first. So I'm going to use IntelliJ to start up the Grails application now. This was running a minute ago, so hopefully it won't take too long to figure out its dependencies. So again, this Grails application has no UI, and it is secured. Let me show you that actually while it's running. So we have Spring Security Core and Spring Security REST installed. You can see them there in our build.gradle file. And if we go to our application.yaml configuration file, you can see that we have Grails plugin Spring Security. None of this stuff here is specific to what we're doing. This is just the standard configuration that you will get when you when you use the quick start command that's provided by the Spring Security and Spring Security REST plugin. So this is all just default configuration to set up the default rules for different URL patterns. You can see, for example, we're making sure that people aren't blocked from accessing JavaScript and CSS files. None of this really matters in our case right now because the server doesn't have any of those files. But that's all set up there by default. I'm not gonna, again, we don't have time to talk about Spring Security REST. If you want to learn more about that, look up Alvaro Sanchez's workshop on that topic. It's a great resource. All right, looks like our server's up and running now. So let's go ahead and look at that. So this is the default JSON output. And you can see that we have a list of our controllers. So notice that we do have our login and logout controller. Those are provided by Spring Security. And then we also have a book controller. So this is where our application starts to come into focus. So let's go ahead and look at that. If we look in our project, look under Grails app and domain, we can see that we have a book domain class. So we are, this is a simple domain class, 2 string properties, should be all familiar to you if you've done anything with Grails. And notice we're using the @resource annotation. That's provided by Grails. And what the resource annotation does is it will generate a RESTful controller for this domain class. There's several options you can provide to it. I'm just specifying a default URI. So we're saying that /API/book is going to be the URL to access book the book endpoints. And then we're also saying that this API is going to be secured and that the user role is required in order to access it. And we can actually demonstrate that now by if we go to our server here and try to hit API/book, this should return us a list of books, but instead we are going to get a 401 page. And because we're in a browser, we're getting this weird HTML error page. But you can see that we got the 401, and that's what we expected because we are not authenticated. And so the @secured annotation is preventing us from accessing that resource. So that's basically our API. Now, obviously, in a real application, you're going to probably want to have your own RESTful controller so you have more control over the actual logic in the controller. However, for a demo like this, and if you ever have just a bunch of domain classes that you need to make quickly available and you don't have a lot of custom logic, the resource annotation is a pretty slick tool for doing that. So we don't have to do any URL mappings or controllers or anything. This annotation generates all of that for us. So that's pretty handy. So that's basically our API. We don't have any other controllers here, just the application controller, which is provided by default. We're not doing anything with that. I do have some code in the Bootstrap to create a user. So notice that we have user and role domain classes. Those are all specific to Spring Security. I'm not going to talk about those right now, but suffice it to say I have code to create a default user. So I can log in. If I use the right credentials, I can authenticate against this server. So let's go ahead and fire up the Vue.js application so we can see what that looks like. So that's going to be the serve task. My slides are actually out of date there. That's one thing that's changed. The start script has been changed to serve in the latest version of Vue CLI. So I changed the Gradle task to match because I want those names to basically be aliases. So the command to start it is now client:serve, and that will start up the server. So that should be running here shortly. There we go. And there we are. So here is our Vue.js application. Now you can already see that this looks a lot like a default Grails application, and that's by design. It's made to, but this is not implemented with GSP. This is all implemented with Angular. Oh, I'm sorry, with Vue.js. So let's go ahead and look at that real quickly here. If we look in the client directory and look under our source, we can see we have an app component, which is actually used for routing, which we don't do any routing in this application, but routing basically lets you have URLs within your single page application. It's a big topic and we're not going to go into it right now. But if we go into our components here, we can see that we have a welcome component. This welcome component is what's rendering all of that, this page you see here. So all of that markup, all the HTML and CSS, that's all being rendered out by this component here. So a lot of this is just default stuff, CSS, a lot of HTML, but we do have some logic here. We do actually have some a login form and some stuff going on. So let's look at how the app works, and then we'll see what the code is doing behind the scenes. So first we can see we're being confronted with a login page, which makes sense because we have a secured API and we want to be able to access that API. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the default credentials that I've already bootstrapped. And we'll click login and let's see if this works. And there we go, we're logged in. We don't have any data yet, but we can see we're now seeing a different UI. We've got a simple form, and then we have a table with no rows, no data. Let's look at how that login works real fast. So here we are looking at our welcome component. This is sort of the main application component for this particular app. We can see that in our data function, one of the properties we are returning is access token. And we see it's just set to null by default. So by default, when you load the page, we don't have an access token. And that means we cannot access any secured APIs. So if we look up here in our template, and right here we have a bit of logic. We check if we have an access token, or rather if our access token is not null, we render out some markup here. If it is null, we're going to render, so that's a v else right here, we're going to render our login form. The login form is pretty simple. It just has a couple of fields to capture username and password. And notice the login form doesn't actually submit anything to the server, right? The login form is going to call a submit login function, which was passed into the form as a prop. If you're familiar with React, props are basically the same as in React. They are attributes that you can pass into your function. So if you look back at our welcome component here, notice that on our login form component, we are saying we are setting the submit login attribute to something called login. We'll look at that in just a second here. But if you look in there, that submit login is the same here as in our props list. And so this is a function that we can call. We don't know what it does. The login form doesn't actually know what submit login does, but it knows how to pass the username and password into it. And that way the login form delegates the actual logic for doing the login call. So it's just a generic form. It could log into anything if it was provided with the correct callback. And this is essentially a callback prop. So we jump back here. Let's look at what the login actually does. So we'll command click on here. So login is a method. We talked about methods earlier. So it's a method on our welcome component. It accepts a username and password. And then we make a fetch call. Fetch is an Ajax library, or actually it's a Ajax API that's I don't know if it's quite native JavaScript yet, but it's going to become part of JavaScript soon. So we're making a post request. I'm not going to go into details of fetch, obviously, we just don't have time for that. But we're making a login request, and then we're parsing the JSON, and we are grabbing the access token out of that response and storing it in our, the access token out of the JSON response and storing it in our state. Once we've done that, we can now call our load books method, which will make the call to our book API. And notice here, we have our authorization header. We're passing in the access token. This format here is the bearer token. There's an RFC for this. It's very standard JWT authentication scheme, nothing specific to Grails here. When we do that, now when we make those requests to API/book, the server will pick up our token, and so long as the token is valid, it will return the data to us. And the same goes for adding a book and deleting a book. They all follow the same basic pattern. Let's jump back to the browser here and see how, make sure this works. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put in a book title here. Let's see. There we go. Add a book by one of my favorite authors. And there we go. It's in our, I'm just gonna add some random data here real fast so you can see. We can add lots of data. Now, if I refresh the page, because I have not implemented any way of storing the access token, when I refresh the page, I'm gonna be logged out. So if I log back in, and there are ways around this, you just have to decide how you want to store the token. And there's security concerns there, obviously. But if I log back in, there's the data. So it was persisted. Everything is there like I expect. I can delete rows. That works as I expect. So we have secured access to our API, which is great. Let's look real quick back here so we can see what the book components are doing really fast here. The book create form, again, is sort of a dumb component. Notice that we're passing in a callback prop, add a book function. And if you look in there, when we submit to create a new book, we don't actually make the AJAX call. We just call our callback function here with the book object that we're storing on our state. So this is an example of two-way data binding. Again, don't have time for this, but essentially the idea is that when you edit the value in the input, it changes the value in the data and vice versa. And so this means that whatever we enter into these text fields is going to populate the book object in our data. When we call add book, we're going to pass that book object to our callback. We jump back here and look at what the add book function does. It creates it's a post request. We create a JSON string for our body out of the book object, and we post that to the server, and we expect it to work, and it does. That's really whirlwind. I apologize. I know we're going kind of fast, but again, we're not going. This is not meant to be a deep dive into Vue.js. So this code is going to be made available. You'll receive a link to it when we send the recording email out. It'll be on GitHub. So you'll be able to see this, and I'll probably make some improvements to this sample code as well over the next couple days. But this is basically what I wanted to show you. So the last thing I'm going to do, and if folks have to drop off, I understand. I'm just going to run this really fast because I've already done it. And I'm reasonably confident that it still works. So I've actually configured the combined build that I talked about previously. And what that means is that I can run a command like this. Assemble server and client. This is a custom Gradle task I've written that will generate both the client both the Vue.js application as well as the Grails application. It's going to combine the two into a single jar file. So notice that we are building for production. So we're making a production build of the Vue app. That's been done. Now that the Vue app is built, the Grails application is going to be packaged as well. And Gradle, I'll show you that command here, is going to copy the front-end application. It's right here. It's going to copy the front-end application into the build directory of the server application, and that's going to create the combined jar file. And so at this point, assuming that everything goes well here and that I don't have anything else running in the background, I can run java-jar and go to our build directory and run the, oops, sorry about that. Java dash, forget where the directory is sometimes. Libs, there it is. server-01.jar is the default name of the file. So if this works, we should see our Grails application fire up with a Vue.js front end. So it's a single server a single deployable artifact. You can drop this on any server that runs Java and fire it up with a command just like that. And it's going to have persistence and everything else set up as well. So let's see if this pulls out correctly here. There we go. So now we're going to localhost 8080. Remember that previously we had to go to localhost 3000 to get our front end over here. But now we're on localhost 8080. There's our server. I can go ahead and log in. My user should be there. There we are. I can add data. Just like that. Everything works as it did before, but we're now running everything off of a single server. So the configuration for all that is detailed in the Grails guide that I'm going to show you in just a second here. So I'm not going to go into all that right now. Let's go ahead and jump back to the slides and wrap this up. And I will answer more questions when we're done here. So like I said, so here, this is a bunch of links that I recommend you check out. This basically covers pretty much everything except for security that we've done so far. So the Vue profile documentation documents how to use the profile, obviously. I've written a Grails guide on how to build a Vue application, which is a slightly more complicated version of what we just saw, minus the security portion. And then there's also a Grails guide on creating a combined build with Grails and Vue. And that's going to show you how to do the trick I just did now, where I ran that jar file and it had the Vue.js application included. So that's a pretty cool trick. So check that out. And then there's another Grails guide on the Vue profile, a bit more specifically. So those are the Grails and Vue resources I wanted to pass along. That brings me to the end. So I apologize. I had to go pretty quick there. So I understand if there's a lot of questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer those. But otherwise, I think I'll kick this back to you, Nikki, if you want to bring this home.
Yes, that sounds good. So thanks everyone for joining. Please do visit our website at objectcomputing.com/events, and you'll find links to all of our upcoming webinars on this similar topic and more. Thanks again, everyone. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Nikki. So I can stick around for a little longer here for any last minute questions. So thank you all for joining, and feel free to drop off as you need to. So let me take a look here. If I don't want to use the resource annotation in domain class, I need to create a new controller and define the URL for the resource and URL mapping. That is correct. That's pretty much what you do. It's exactly what you would do. The resource annotation is simply a shortcut. And it's really helpful when you're just getting a new project started. And it can also, I've had instances in production applications where it didn't make sense, where I had a bunch of domain classes that just needed a bare minimum API exposed. It was all secured, so it wasn't exposed out, to the outside world, and I didn't need to configure it. So there are times where a resource will work, but otherwise you'll create a controller. References, the hook into SAML for security. I would suggest just go ahead and either post on the Grails Slack or write to OCI. I don't have any information on SAML handy right now. Let's see. For enterprise application, what is your preference for front-end development, React or Vue? Excellent question. My preference actually still is React, but that's because I'm a little bit of a JavaScript snob, actually. Hopefully not in a unpleasant way, but I like how JavaScript works. I like the conventions. I like even the limitations of the language, especially in the newer versions. And so React is more pure JavaScript, and so that's why it appeals to me. Because I feel like I understand JavaScript pretty well, I kind of know what's going on when I'm using React. Whereas with Vue, there's a little more magic going on, and that's not a bad thing. It really is a preference, and it's up to each developer, each team to decide if that's more important to them or not. To be honest, React and Vue are very comparable, though. I don't want to exaggerate the differences, because there's a lot of things they have in common, and they're both very viable libraries. Let's see. Just clicking on some of these off so I can grab the list. Is the book and the example by Ken Cousin a real upcoming book? No comment. Actually, it's not entirely secret. Yes, Ken and I are working on an upcoming book by that title, but no ETA yet. So let's see. Any pointers on the best way to persist the access token? Let's see, within the single page application. That's a complicated question. So the question is, how do we persist the access token? That's not easy to answer because the easiest thing to do is to store it in local storage, for example. However, there's a lot of security concerns with that. One of the big concerns that you need to keep in mind whenever you're using these front-end frameworks is that you're typically bringing in a lot of other libraries, dependencies that you don't know about and that you don't control. And if any of those dependencies are compromised, well, that's code running on your domain. And so it has access to your local storage. And so a malicious package can access anything you store in local storage or in session storage even, because it's all running from the same domain. So that is a concern. The most secure option I've seen, and if you Google this, you'll probably find the same article I'm talking about, but is to use an HTTP only cookie, a secured cookie, is one of the safer ways that's for storing access tokens. Otherwise, which is the other option, is simply don't persist it. Keep it within your state and try to write your app in such a way that the user does not have to refresh it, and they should be able to keep using it. But that's not always a viable option. So, yep, I can't give you the definitive answer on that, but it's definitely something you need to consider. So I think that covers both of those questions there. What advantage or disadvantage would there be in using this same type of application, a Vue app, and a RESTful controller in Micronaut versus Grails 4? That's a great question, and we had a similar question about that earlier, about Grails 4 specifically versus Micronaut. That's a big topic, but I think the way I like to think of it is that Micronaut is really designed to make microservices easy, and to make you productive when working with microservices. And so if you're building a microservice architecture and you want to include a single page application and you need to have a RESTful backend, for example, yeah, I would use Micronaut. There's certainly no problem using Micronaut. Now, there are some things that you get in Grails that you don't have in Micronaut. And a big one for me is JSON views. JSON views currently does not work with Micronaut, largely because it requires Groovy, and Micronaut does not require Groovy. And so Grails 4 gives me a really expressive way of defining my JSON output from my API. I really value that. And so if I'm not specifically building this as part of a microservice federation where I need to talk to other services and do event-driven stuff or whatever, or reactive flows across multiple services and so forth. If I'm not doing any of that, then Grails 4 has a lot going for it. There's a lot of features in it that, just because Micronaut is more of a microservice-focused framework, it's not going to necessarily include. So it's not a ding against Micronaut or against Grails. They're just both designed for specific use cases. And so if I'm working in a microservice federation, I'm probably going to lean towards Micronaut. If I'm not, or if the front end and the associated RESTful backend are standalone enough, then I might still consider using Grails 4, even in a microservice federation, especially because now that we have Micronaut included, essentially, or at least Micronaut features included within Grails 4, now it's even more compelling because I can use Micronaut clients, for example, to talk to other Micronaut services from my Grails 4 application, which gives me kind of the best of both worlds. So I think there's still a lot of advantages to using Grails 4, especially if you're building a single page application. But I've done both. I've used Micronaut, I've used Grails specifically for as a backend for Vue.js. They both work just fine. Is the is the single page application a progressive web application? This particular one is not. There is support for progressive web applications in Vue, but the solution for that is going to be the same as with any Vue.js application. There's nothing Grail specific about that. And then we have, can we use Vue.js inside of GSP views? You absolutely can do that. If you're going to do that, I would recommend using the standard web profile, probably. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. Use the default Grails profile with GSPs, and then grab the Vue.js library, either using the script tag that I showed at the beginning of the talk, or there's other ways you can pull it in. In fact, there's actually a Gradle plugin that will let you install dependencies like Vue from npm without using npm at all. And so that's probably what I would do. I would use the stock Grails web profile with GSPs, and I would put a div on my GSP, and I would have a script tag and instantiate my Vue instance and give it that div's ID, and go from there. So yeah, very, very doable. Not a single page application, so that's why I didn't talk about it, but definitely doable. Let's see, GSP and server-side rendering dead in your opinion? That's a good question. So there's the ability in Java to render JavaScript on the server and output the rendered HTML. And what this lets you do is lets you save or skip that initial render call. When you load up a single page application, there'll be this blank screen while the browser crunches all the JavaScript to get the app rendered. You don't have that problem if you can render this on the server. And so there is the ability in Java to do that. I won't say it's dead. I would say that it's not catching on the way that I think some folks thought it might. I suspect it probably is being used by folks for specific use cases. The obvious one is if SEO is really important and you really need to return straight HTML right away. Although I think that's becoming less of an issue because search engines are getting smarter about how they handle that. Two-way data binding versus one-way data binding. I agree with you, Angel. One-way data binding does improve predictability in client state. That's a big reason why I like React. Two-way data binding is more intuitive for folks sometimes and is obviously more convenient. So I think it's a matter of developer preference there. But I do appreciate the more deterministic one-way binding. Use vanilla Grails or a single page approach. Yeah, I mean, don't build a single page if you don't need it. If you don't have developers that are familiar with that and you don't actually have use cases for it, it's certainly not a requirement. There's still advantages to a server-side rendered static UI, and there's no need to write everything in Vue or React just because it's the new thing. That said, if you are interested in things like progressive web applications and you are interested in some of these other modern JavaScript tools that are out there, there's a whole ecosystem out there that you might appreciate and that might be useful to you. So it's certainly worth looking into going more for a single page application approach. But I don't think that it's a requirement. I mean, jQuery still works, it's still being developed. And there's still plenty of folks that like that. So I don't think that it's a requirement, but keep an eye on what's going on out there, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you can't find developers and you don't have a good handle of what's going on. So yeah, I think I'm gonna call it at this point. But thank you all for the good questions. Hopefully this was helpful for you all. And if you have any feedback, any additional questions, go ahead and send them either via email or Slack. And I do recommend check out the Grails Slack channel. There's a lot more people on it than me, and lots of folks are willing to help. But feel free to flag me on the Slack channel. I'm not always on it every day, but if people ping me, I will check in and answer. So with that said, we're over time. Thank you all. And I think I'm going to call it at this point.